The story I'm about to tell is a variation of the old standard, the Thrifty Tailor. In the versions I've heard, the tailor is always a man. But you and I both know that behind every good tailor stands a demanding customer. So my version has a demanding customer. Let's do the story together. A tailor and his wife were invited to a Lunar New Year party. "Let's go," he said. But I don't have a thing to wear," she said. "What do you mean you don't have a thing to wear? Your cupboard is full of things that you've worn only once, if at all. Money does not grow on trees, my dear." "Husband, it's the Lunar New Year. If I don't get a new dress made of a special fabric, which is as soft as silk, as strong as steel, as dark as night, as red as courage, and as bright as flowers, I will not go to that party." She flounced off. That poor man. He hunted high and low, and he could not find any fabric matching his wife's description. But the following week, he received a gift in the post, a package from an old friend in Shanghai. In it was a piece of cloth that exactly matched his wife's specifications. It was as soft as silk, as strong as steel, as dark as night, as red as courage, and as bright as flowers. Perfect for the Lunar New Year. He set to work immediately. He didn't tell her. He measured, and he measured, and he measured, and he cut, and he sewed, and he stitched, and he made her this dress. She loved that dress. She wore it and she wore it and she wore it. She wore it here, she wore it there, she wore it everywhere. She wore it and she wore it and she wore it until it was quite worn out. At least she thought it was quite worn out. But when he looked at it, he noticed there was still some good material left. So he measured, and he measured, and he measured, and he cut, and he sewed, and he sewed, and he sewed, and he stitched, and he made her this cocktail dress. She loved that dress. It was just a little bit low in the front and just a little bit high at the back, and it was slashed all the way down to there. She wore it here, she wore it there, she wore it everywhere. She wore it and she wore it and she wore it until it was quite worn out. At least she thought it was worn out. But when he looked at it, he noticed there was still some good fabric left. So he measured, and he cut, and he sewed, and he stitched, and he made her this skinny top. She loved that top. She wore it here, she wore it there, she wore it to the beach, she wore it to the cinema, she wore it everywhere. She wore it and she wore it and she wore it until it started falling apart. Aww. She thought it was all worn out, but when he looked at it, there's still some good fabric left, he said. And so he measured, and he measured, and he measured, and he cut, and he cut, and he cut, and he sewed, and he stitched, and he made this cap. He loved the cap. It even had protection for the neck. He loved it. He thought of keeping it for himself, but he loved his wife, so he set it aside. But when he looked at the trimmings that were left, he noticed there was still some stuff that he could use. He measured, and he measured, and he measured, and he cut, and he sewed. No, he didn't. He only stitched and stitched and stitched. And he made this buttonhole flower. Oh, he loved that buttonhole flower. He wore it, and he wore it, and he wore it. He wore it here, he wore it there. He wore it everywhere. He wore it, and he wore it, and he wore it until it was all worn out. And when he looked at that tattered flower, it really was all worn out. There was no usable fabric left. But there was plenty of material for this story. And now, the story is yours, and you have a project to keep you busy and entertained in these stay-home days.